So good evening. I'm just going to show you a little bit of my painting of the background of my blue tit, and also how I actually paint the bird using slightly different techniques. First of all, with the background, I'm just going to wet another stretch of my background with clear water. I'm using a number 4 natural head brush so that I can lay down lots of water very quickly. It's important to use either a large brush or a brush that can hold a lot of water in one go, so that your background stays wet when you add any paint to it, so that you can keep the paint strokes in your background all soft, so as not to detract with hard edges from the main subject, which is the blue tit here. Remember, the background is just intended really to support the main star of the show, which here is the blue tit. So I've wet the background around the bird. Doesn't matter if you go over the branch that the blue tit's perched on, because it's a lighter colour than most of the background. And as I paint the clear water onto the background around the blue tit, I'm just keeping an eye on how wet the surface is, ensuring it's still wet when I add any colour to it. So that's nice and wet, the background. I'm now going to go into the background with my mix of of cobalt blue and light red, dropping that into the background. I have to work quite quickly now so that the background doesn't dry before I apply any paint to the background. As I say, I don't want hard edges, and painting onto dry background will cause hard edges. Once I've laid down a little bit of paint, I'll now stretch out that paint, in effect diluting it a little bit with a wet clean brush. You don't have to cover every inch of the paper in paint. You can leave some gaps for a bit of variation. And I look again at my background to ensure that the background is still wet. And whilst it's wet and I've got some quite strong colour in my background, I'll put a little bit stronger colour alongside the yellow of the blue tit, creating contrast between the warm yellow and the cool dark grey background, bluey grey background. Will help make the blue tit stand out against the background there. Okay, and whilst the dark blue is still shiny but not saturated, so shiny but beginning to lose a little bit of its shine, but not turning to the point of being dull and matte, I can add some a little bit of salt to my background. For a bit more of that lovely frosty feel, I'll let that table salt that I've shaken onto the background do its thing. What's happening actually is the salt is drawing up the water to it, absorbing the water, and with it the pigment, the paint that is carried by the water, is absorbed, and as a result creates some nice white patches in the background, which give a sense of wintry flurries of snow in the background. So whilst that background is drying here on the left of the blue tit, I'm going to work on the opposite side of the blue tit on this right hand side of the blue tit, working on some of the yellow feathering around the legs, and I'm going to use a number 0 round brush. It's a synthetic brush. It doesn't hold lots of water, but doesn't need to because I'm only working at quite a small scale. So I'm using just clear paint, clear water should I say. I'm copying from a photograph I took, which is out of picture at the moment. I can see it, you can't, and I've enlarged it just so that I can see the detail a bit. But actually there isn't a lot of detail in my painting. It's suggested if there is really much detail, and I'm just adding clear water to the parts of the blue tit that I'm going to colour in lemon yellow. Lemon yellow is quite an acidic yellow, perfect for the colours of blue tits. So whilst that's still a little bit damp, the right hand side of this blue tit, I'm just lifting a little bit of that water off because I've put it on a little bit heavily. So it's still wet but not too wet. And now I'm going to drop in a fairly stiffish mix of lemon yellow, so that I've got a bit of control over where the yellow lands on the paper, and so that it doesn't bleed too far. I need a little bit of control, a little bit of precision, and so I've got quite a dry mix of lemon yellow applied with a damp brush. And again into the damp paper with a damp brush, adding a little bit of this lemon yellow. Just cleaning my brush in clear water and just wetting the edge of parts of the yellow just to soften it off, to merge nicely with the white lower breast of the blue tit. Got a little bit of yellow tinge in my water there, so I lift it with a dry piece of toweling, and I'll just let that settle into the paper, that wet paint. And that, in the meantime, the background is drying on the left hand side of the blue tit, so I'll be able to now go back in with a brush of clear water into this left flank of the blue tit. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to strengthen the tone a little bit on this left side of the blue tit. So I've just wet it, clean water, just tidying up this right hand side, and then I'm going to drop in a little bit of the lemon yellow. Again, quite a dry mix really into this damp paper on the damp side, left hand side of the blue tit. And although it's bleeding into this area of the blue tit, it's not out of control. I've got full control with my brush, and I can move the paint around a little bit with my brush into the places that I want the feathering to land. That's as much as I'll do with the main body of the blue tip for the moment. Whilst that is drying off, and I can see that the very bottom of the body is almost dry, I can just then start on the tail. I'll wet the tail. So the tail is now wet, and I'm letting that water just settle into the paper a bit, and that gives me also a little bit of time to mix a grey for the blue tit's tail. It's a sort of grey, purpley grey, so I've got a mix of cadmium red and cobalt blue. And I've added a tiny little bit of white gouache to it, so it's going to be quite opaque, my mix. And there is the base layer, if you like, of the blue tit's tail. Whilst that's drying, I'll keep away now from the tail, and I'm going to work on the neck of the blue tip behind the head. You'll notice, as compared with the crown of the blue tit, or the nape here, I'll be painting a darker blue right around the back of the head, and so I'll be using a French ultramarine for the back of the head. And I'll add to the French ultramarine a very small amount of burnt umber to create a blue verging on black. Very dark blue it appears. Again, a very dry mix, and I'm using this #1 brush. Hasn't got a particularly fine point on it, but because I'm using such a dry mix, I've got a lot of control over where the paint goes. Remember, not too much water on the brush, and you can therefore then have full control over very fine, delicate parts of the bird when you're painting in the features that are quite delicate. And now I'm going to bring the bird alive by adding the eye stripe and the eye itself. The eye stripes are sort of browny grey, so I'm going to use some burnt umber and cobalt blue. And I'm using a #1 brush, but it's got very few hairs on it. It's really more like a 0, this brush. And again, with very little water on my brush, I've got full control over really how much paint I'm applying, and know that that paint is going to be delivered precisely to the spot where I want it to go. So there's the eye stripe painted in, and the pupil the actual eye itself, I'm going to paint with French ultramarine and burnt umber. So a dark brown and a dark blue. The eye appears to be not completely round, but verging on round come oval. There we go, so there's the eye painted. And I'll paint with the same very dark grey stroke black the bottom of the bill. And the bill itself is a very sort of light purple. So I'll use a bit of cadmium red and a bit of cobalt blue, very dilute for the actual bill. And I'll leave that just to dry. And whilst I leave that to dry, I'm just going to boost the colour of the blue on the crown of the blue tit's head using Windsor blue and cobalt blue. If you haven't got Windsor blue, cobalt blue on its own is fine as well. So again, with this number 1 very fine brush, I'm adding fine detail to the crown of the blue tit's head. And I'll let that dry for the moment. So that's how I paint the blue tit, very finely. I'm just going to paint in a little bit of shadow in this area. This is cast shadow cast by the branch and the upper body of the blue tit. So what I'll do is I'll wet the whole of this pale area of the blue tit. And what I do is I just let that sink in, that clear water sink into the paper a bit. And in the meantime, I'll just pick up a mix of cadmium red and cobalt blue. Which will give me my purple colour shadow. And I've dropped that purple in damp onto damp. So again, the shadow is just a soft purple shadow on the white of the blue tit's lower chest. And I'll take that shadow round across the yellow of the right side of the blue tit, which is dry, And then I'm going to add some shadow to this bottom right area of the blue tip. Again, what I'm doing is painting a very thin glaze of purple, so it's a very dilute mixture of my cobalt blue and cadmium red over the yellow feathering. It might sound counterintuitive to be painting purple over yellow, but because it's such a very dilute mixture of purple, it's more just a glaze really, and you can still see the yellow through it. So that's looking nice on the right hand side of the blue tip. Just adding a little, let's just add a little bit more shadow on this right side of the blue tip. And a little bit more shadow cast by the perch and the upper body of the blue tip. And whilst that's drying, I'm just going to create some little flecks of feathering off to the left side of the blue tip, using a number 0 very fine brush, brushing away from the body of the blue tip, and just releasing pressure on the brush as I brush away from the body, so that the paint and the brush application just tapers off. Adding, this is now wet onto dry paper, just adding a little bit of extra colour to the blue tips, feathering in places just to give it a bit more oomph. And this side, this right side is dry now, so I can add a little bit more yellow to the right side, again to give it a bit more oomph. Lemon yellow with a number 0 brush. Very dry mixture, hardly any water on my brush. And that will be about it for the blue tit, for this blue tit. What I just want to do is I want to add a little suggestion of feathering in the face of the blue tit. The blue tit's face is not completely white, so what I'll do is I'll wet the face with clear water. Got rather a lot of water on my brush then, so I'm just lifting some of that water off where it's pooling on the paper. And then with a very fine brush, with a number 0 brush, I'm just going to drop in a very dilute mix of cadmium red and cobalt blue. So a very fine, very dilute purple mix. Into one or two areas that I'd penciled in. It's very subtle really, there's not much that you can see perhaps from my painting just there, but that's enough just to finish off the head of the blue tit, and probably finish off this painting from the point of view of the actual blue tit here at the bottom of the scene. Actually, before I finish, I'm just going to add a little bit of strength of tone here, which is cast shadow, wet onto dry. It's quite a harsh shadow, cast by the perches on the blue tit's tail. I'm just strengthening the tone of this leg. And putting in its talons, its claws. And that will be it for the moment with the blue tit. The background you can see now that the salt has done its job, combining with the wet blue-grey paint has created this sort of mottled effect, which is what I'd wanted for the wet snow. And I hope that helps with your understanding.